let's do this. And we're live. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the CICW Book Talk. My name is Ermin Sinanovic. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University. And I am pleased to welcome you all to this book discussion. The book in question is Remaking Muslim Lives, Post-War Islam, Everyday Islam in Post-War Bosnia and Herzegovina by Dr. David Henig, who is Associate Professor at the Utrecht University in the Netherlands. And we are also pleased to have with us Dr. Janita Karic, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Humboldt University in Germany. Welcome to both of you.
Hello, Ermin. Hello, Janita. Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. We also have audience, and we welcome you all. This is an interactive presentation in a way, so feel free to engage with the chat function on your YouTube. You can submit your questions or comments. Just please make sure to identify yourself, your affiliation, or your country so that we can have some idea who you are. The flow of the presentation is going to be like this. David is going to speak for about 25-30 minutes about the book, and then Janita will speak for about 10 to 15 minutes. She's going to give her thoughts about the book, her comments, maybe some questions for David. And then after that, we're going to turn it to the audience, to your Q&A. So in the course of their presentations, if anything comes up that you would like to know more about, or you have an interesting insight or comment, feel free to share it in the YouTube chat. Just briefly about the book. The book was a result of several years of research that Dr. Henig did in Bosnia and Herzegovina. He speaks the language, he immersed himself in the field, and he really studied the way in which Islam is practiced as an everyday phenomenon in certain part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is where he did his research, and he's going to tell us more about that. And basically, it is about making sense of the long history of Muslim presence in Europe, but also about post-war traumas and how people make sense of Islam in their everyday life, and how Islam gives them meaning and sense in their everyday life, and how they do that within the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So I hope that you will all pay close attention to David's presentation. So David, without further ado, the floor is yours now.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me just sort out my notes. And okay, so thank you for having me, Ermin. It's a real privilege to be part of the book talk series that you and your center have been organizing during the COVID times. I watched some of the videos and I learned a lot from these presentations. So thank you for that. And also a huge thank you to Janita for being interested in reading the book, many versions of the book, and again today for her willingness to act as a discussant to talk about the book yet again. So thank you. Can you hear me fine, just by the way, guys? Yeah, good, okay. So when I started thinking about our conversation that we are having today, it dawned on me that although the book was published in October 2020, which was in the midst of the pandemic and draining online teaching for many of us, I still haven't been able to fully absorb the fact that the book is out and that I should finally build some kind of critical distance from it. So I'm not going to present a polished narrative what exactly the book is about, because for me at least, it still has so many layers, stories, and experiences interwoven together that I still feel a little bit uncomfortable to prioritize some over the others. But I happen to know that Janita is going to present a rather splendid summary of the book later. And therefore, in the rest of my presentation or talk, or how to call it, I would like to focus in my part on three things. Firstly, I would like to talk about how did the book come about, and tell a few words about its genealogy, because I think it's quite important to take these things into consideration. Secondly, I would like to say a few words about some of the main interventions that I hope the book makes or will make at some point when people will happen to read it. And thirdly, and with regards to also the mission of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World, I would like to conclude my presentation by linking these interventions within or connecting it to a wider context of the social and political predicaments that not only my Bosnian friends and interlocutors I write about in the book, but I would say many of us actually face in our contemporary moment. And here I mean the issues of Islamophobia, historical denialism, and revisionism, and the politics of intolerance in particular. Okay, so without further ado, let me say a few words first about how did the book come about. And Ermin has already mentioned that it's a result of several years of research, field work. And in fact, it's now about, I think, 15 years in the making or something like that. So the book started as my PhD project back in the mid 2000, and I have been interested for probably even longer than that in the questions related to post-Cold War transformations of everyday lives in the former state socialist countries in Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe. And in particular, in the topics around political economy, religion, and memory. And don't ask me why. I've been interested in these topics. I can't really tell you why, but I think it has something to do with probably also my personal biography, as I grew up in this part of the world as well in the 80s. And also in the 1990s, I followed as a child and later as a teenager also the wars in former Yugoslavia quite closely. I guess because people around me at the time at my school, so my parents and other people were actively involved in organizing humanitarian aid at the time. And later, when I started studying at the university, quite a few of my teachers, I actually found out work as humanitarian workers in Bosnia and Kosovo. So it's been always somehow kind of part of my life in a way. But it has also something to do with this topic of studying large-scale transformations, societal transformations in a real time, in a way that I actually found quite kind of interesting to think about. So that's probably sort of one of the backgrounds behind this book. But anyway, that's the sort of personal part of the story. But as I said, the book started as a PhD project in social anthropology in the UK. And in 2008, I arrived to Bosnia to conduct my long-term ethnographic fieldwork. And the first fieldwork took about 18 months, so 1.5 years. I was living in villages in a highland area, as Emi mentioned, in central Bosnia. And I chose to work in this area called Zvezda Highlands for 2 interrelated reasons that I also describe in the book, and I'll just summarize them here. So the first reason why I decided to base my fieldwork in this area is that central Bosnia is a historically significant area, not only because it was the seat of the Bosnian kings, the Bosnian church, and so on, but also because it was the point of the encounter between the Ottomans and local population. So the Ottoman Conquest actually took place in this area. And as I mentioned in the book, this is still very much part of historical consciousness. There are many legends about it. The local toponymy is full of references to it. And there is also a very rich sacred landscape that I write about in the book, and rituals and practices of veneration associated with them. So I was kind of interested in studying these topics, which brings me to my second point. And I wanted to study these Muslim ritual practices and sacred landscapes that, although transformed over time and over many multiple political, geopolitical crises and regimes, and how we will call it. But what was interesting is, for me, from the beginning, was that they have never ceased to exist. Yeah. So there's a long continuity of these practices and of the sacred landscape and so on. And that's what I was interested in studying. So in order to answer the question, what it means to live a Muslim life in the present, I was interested in the degree of continuity despite so many ruptures that people I have been working with and the region where I've been working with have experienced or went through, have gone through. And those of us who were studying or were interested in these topics of religion, religious life, and so on in kind of early 2000, mid 2000, in this context after socialism, we had to deal with this kind of arguments and assumptions among many political scientists, commentators, and so on, that there was some kind of rupture and then religious revival, that basically religion somehow disappeared during communism, socialism, and so on, and it just emerged only in the 1990s. So there's this revival of religious lives and all these kind of arguments that we are all familiar with. A related argument was that people were somehow non-believers or didn't have, lost religion, sense of religion, and things like that. So, so I basically, when I arrived to the region, started working there, I immediately realized that basically it had no resemblance which I was finding during my time in the field, and as I say in the book, instead I decided to document Muslim lives in Bosnia that span generations, so they go back to socialism and even further, and cut across multiple actually national and global socio-political transformations. So the most obvious example, obviously, of rupture when it comes to researching Bosnia in the past few decades was the Bosnian War, and especially in the social science literature, the war is often taken as, again, the kind of year zero from which kind of things started sort of happening. So on the one hand, there was this sort of argument, religion after socialism as something that didn't exist before. On the other hand, there's this body of post-war literature that, again, in a certain way, kind of ignores the pre-war past, right? That kind of is almost kind of missing or non-existent. So here I am, basically, sort of trying to sort of figure out these continuities in the context of these ruptures on the one hand, and the scholarship that kind of takes these ruptures as a point of departure as well. So So unlike many other studies, what I try to do in my book is to situate these ruptures, and as Ermin mentioned, also traumas and things that people went through, and try to situate them in a broader historical span on the one hand, but on the other hand, I also try to situate the lives of my interlocutors in the context of post-war political economy that has had extremely devastating consequences for many people in Bosnia of all walks of life. And actually for many of my interlocutors, and again, I talk about it in the book, the post-war years have been for them as devastating as what they actually went through, for example, during the war. And again, I give some examples in the book. So that's another kind of segment of the book, or something that influenced me when I was kind of putting it together. And in case of the rural areas where I was working, it meant living in poverty, long-term unemployment. Being 10 years unemployed was like no exception. It was quite a norm. Examples of emptying villages and are emptying villages, out-migration, among other things, either to the cities or completely abroad. So I also basically had to somehow bring this dimension of everyday life, if you will, into the equation, so to speak. So how to kind of reconcile these two things, this material precarity in the post-war context and religious experience. This is also the reason why, although the book started as a PhD project, initially interested in religious rituals and stuff like that, I decided to continue, rather than publishing my results immediately. I decided to continue with my fieldwork basically until the present days. And the book, in the end, covers all these transformations and metamorphoses of Muslim lives in Bosnia for more than a decade. So it kind of covers roughly period 2007, 2008 till 2019, really. So it's more than a decade, actually. So it's not only the book, is not only an ethnographic snapshot of kind of everyday life or reality, or how to call it, but it is a certain kind of what maybe I would call now, I don't call it in the book like that, a kind of ethnographic history that actually sort of tries to capture these developments over a longer period of time. Okay, and the final focus that I arrive at when I started actually writing up my finding is the question, and I will cite from the book, what it means to live a Muslim life, and what it means to live a Muslim life amid the political breakdowns, economic deprivation, and transformation of religious institutions in post-socialist, post-war Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the book revolves around the question of how Muslim lives and cultural values have been reconfigured in the face of ruptures caused by political violence and cultural and economic dispossession ensuing from the violent disintegration of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia in 1992 and its aftermath. It is an ethnographic study about the hard-to-name period after the post-war, as well as the post-socialist condition. And I think this is crucial for our conversation today, and about the role Muslim religious experience and everyday historical work play in shaping and making sense of it all in the present. That's how the book kind of sort of developed eventually. And what I try to do in answering this question in the book is to trace Muslim religious experience through which my interlocutors make sense of the world around them and their own lives, be it the war, economic precarity, or, for example, caring for family fields or trees or houses. And I do it in two ways in the book. So the book is divided into two parts. The first part is called Making and Unmaking Village Lives. And in the first part, I try to cover how the post-socialist and post-war fabric of village life is understood and how it is infused with Islam. Yeah? So meaning making through Islam to basically political economy, we can say, of the post-war Bosnia. And in the second part of the book, which is called Vital Exchange, I try to offer a reverse perspective and explore how Islam and religious experience are understood and how each is infused with the post-socialist and post-war predicaments, as well as opportunities. And here I cover topics such as prayer, sacred landscape, Islamic time, calendars, but also dreams, the practices of istikara, but also the politics of memory, and situate, for example, the development of post-war memory sites in the context of sacred landscape. So how we can, for example, understand the memorial sites for the Bosnian martyrs in the larger context of Bosnian sacred landscape. So again, situating it in this sort of larger historical continuity of the practices of remembering the dead. So anyway, so this is kind of an overview how the project started many years ago and how it ended eventually, which brings me to the second point I would like to talk about very briefly now, which is what kind of intervention I wanted to make, or I envisage to make. I'm not sure whether I was successful. It's up to you to decide. But I do hope that the book at least offers some interventions. And I want to mention briefly two that seem to me in particular important. So personally, for me, the key intervention, and something I was really struggling with for a long time, was how to write and how to frame the study of Islam and Muslim lives, not only in Bosnia, but in Southeast Europe more kind of broadly, in a way that wouldn't reduce the argument into what I call the identitarian discourse, by which basically I mean that there is a long tradition when writing about Muslims in Bosnia and beyond, that we reduce our argument only into writing basically about Muslims as being an ethnic group, an ethnic identity. And I cite in the book as an example of that Ernest Gellner, who kind of, I don't want to blame him for everything because he, in a way, had no business with Bosnia, but he, for some reason, decided in his famous Nations and Nationalism to actually pick Bosnia to write about these things. So I decided to pick him in turn. So Gellner boldly and unforgettably actually wrote about Islam in Bosnia, and here I will quote because I think it's often forgotten, but quite, I think, unbelievable quote. Nowadays, to be a Bosnian Muslim, you need not believe that there is no God but God and then Muhammad is his prophet, but you do need to have lost that faith. Yeah, end of quote. And as I write in the book, it is safe to say that Gellner was wrong, at least as far as the religious experience of Muslims in the Zvezda Highlands, where I was working, are concerned. And again, tracing these histories of religious practice, memories, and so on over generations, I basically sort of try to show that, this argument is basically wrong, and there's like nothing about lost faith that Gellner was sort of suggesting. However, the point is that this argument captures something very important about the political and scholarly stance toward Islam and religion in Southeast Europe, and more broadly in the context of the modern secular nation state, especially in Europe. And this problem, and this is a problem with the methodological nationalism that dominates the study of religious experiences, conduct, and lives, portraying them as locked in conventional geographical ordering of the nation state, its borders, and secular political sensibilities. And as I argue and try to show in the book, is that this is a position that reduces a vast array of experiences with the divine into discourses on the politics of identity or difference, and silences and dehistoricizes other ideas and practices that play an important role in Muslims' articulations, what it means to be Muslim and live a Muslim life. Okay, so that's one of the main interventions that I hope the book makes into it. And in kind of my answer to it, how to go about it and avoid this, I develop in the book a sort of framework that I call Vital Exchange. The whole one part of the book is about that. And I know that Janita will cover Vital Exchange in her comments, so I will not, because I'm conscious of time, I will not go into kind of details, what I mean exactly by that. But I try to show on a number of examples throughout the book that living a Muslim life in Bosnia is ordered by deep relations of obligations and care among the living, the dead, and the divine. And these relationships are generations deep. They are governed by notions of exchange and reciprocity, and villages' conceptions of what it means to be Muslim and live a Muslim life are ultimately oriented towards the quest of salvation in the afterlife. It's a pursuit that influences their actions in the world here and now. So it's a kind of perpetual, basically, form of care and exchange that I call vital. So I basically want to avoid this question, who I am, this identitarian discourse, and rather look at the question that people ask every day, basically. That's the kind of everyday Islam I talk about, which was the question of how to live, how to live well, how to live good, how to live in a kind of life, that will satisfy basically God and kind of will forge, the path towards the afterlife, basically. So anyway, so Janita will talk about it a little bit more in her comments, but that's a kind of framework that I offer as a sort of alternative to that. Okay, so that's one kind of set of interventions that I hope the book makes. This approach, however, I also hope will make a certain intervention to the kind of conventional studies of Islam, social science studies of Islam, which are often kind of inspired or rooted in the work of Talal Asad and other scholars who treat Islam as a coherent discursive tradition. But in places like Bosnia, in the context of multi-layered socio-political ruptures, such approaches are not very helpful. Yeah, I'm nearly there. In rural Bosnia, the forms and practices of mediating Islamic religious tradition are often situated in villagers' material world, as I show, fields, trees, houses, and so on. And these are understood through everyday historical work rather than in devotional or doctrinal positions that arise solely from the scriptural discourses that predominate in revived Islamic piety movements that have emerged after socialism and that also took inspiration from this Assadian scholarship. Which brings me to the second set of interventions, and it's also related to the final topic of my presentation, which is the broader kind of ramifications of these interventions for what we face today. And the second intervention really is about, how do we debate and write about Islam and Muslim lives in Europe? And one thing I realized over the years is that most of these debates on Islam and Muslims in Europe are often reduced to contemporary immigration issues, right? So when we talk about Islam in Europe, we talk about first, third, or whatever generation of immigrants and so on. and often this whole area of Europe is excluded from these conversations. And the first intervention that I made, that Islam is kind of conflated with only ethnic or ethno-national identity, kind of contributes to these silences, right? Because they are not real Muslims, you know, it's kind of ethnic identity, and that's why we don't need to really talk about them when we talk about Islam in Europe and so on. So, so I think it is really, really, really important in at this moment when we are, you know, dealing and challenging Islamophobia, historical denialism, when it comes to Srebrenica genocide and other things, to follow these Muslim stories that are the way I do it in my book, that really span generations, cut across these thresholds of multiple national as well as global sociopolitical transformations. Because, as I try to show in the book, as stories of the past told in the present, they persistently remind us and offer themselves up amid a continuous reality of dehistoricization, erasures, and omissions. Yeah, so by tracing the entwinements of historical consciousness and religious experience embedded in the stories and actions of my Bosnian friends and interlocutors, I hope that this book paves the way for rethinking and writing against the historical silences that pervade popular and scholarly accounts of Muslim lives in Europe today. So I will finish here for now. Maybe if there are any questions after Janita's comments that still kind of I should answer about the book, I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you so much, David. Thank you for this presentation. Once again, for those who have just joined us, we are discussing this book, Remaking Muslim Lives, Everyday Islam in Postwar Bosnia and Herzegovina. And the author, David Henig, had just presented, talked about the book. And now we have Dr. Janita Karic, who is a postdoctoral researcher at Humboldt University in Berlin. She's going to give about 10 to 15 minutes her thoughts and comments on the book. At the same time, I would just like to remind everyone that you have the chat function in YouTube. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to type it there. Just please identify yourself and your location or institution. So Janita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ermin, for the organization and for inviting me to be a discussant of this book. I'm very excited to be in that role today. As a curious outsider, I have observed how the book was shaped, how it grew, and how it changed for almost a decade. In the process, I was inspired by both the author's commitment to his interlocutors from the Zvezda Highlands, as well as his methodological integrity and determination to direct the research of contemporary Bosnia away from the dominant academic discourses that seem determined to fixate Bosnia and its people to a grid of never-changing ethno-national identitarian frameworks, which observe religion as a subordinate, as secondary, as static in the process of making the modern Bosnian identity. So as a result of applying such analytical frameworks, Bosnian Muslims were often cut off from their co-religionists, while being ultimately tied to contingencies of the nation state. So going against the grain, Henig proposes looking at how Bosnian Muslims make meaning of their religion in their lived context that has been full of socio-political ruptures, but also with awareness of different temporalities and practices which also ensure continuity. So these temporalities, which take into account ruptures such as the Bosnian War, as well as eschatological potentialities of the otherworldly fate, define Bosnian Muslims' moral horizons. And in defining those, as Henig states, the true question of their lived religion is how to live, rather than who I am. Thus, Henig turns away from the preconceived paradigms that fixate the Bosnian subject to a role of a mere puppet of the political top-down processes. He rejects the focus on the identity itself, and instead he wants to zoom in on continuous, painstaking, and above all, creative ways in which Bosnian Muslims weave and embed Islam in the unpredictable cadence of their lives. So in order to do so, the author is bound by two perspectives, those of time and those of place. As he focuses on the post-war decades, which is a shapeless and unwieldy period that for many Bosnians feels like a long pit of stagnation. Henig actually captures a rapidly disappearing time in a life of a community that is quickly dissolving due to post-war precarity and migrations to larger Bosnian cities and countries of Central and Western Europe. So in this way, the author is almost racing with time, just like several ethnographers and anthropologists before him in the long 20th century. So here I'm reminded of Vera Erlich, whose study of 300 interwar Yugoslav families feels in many ways like a farewell letter to the rapidly disintegrating patriarchal family structures in the Balkans. And I'm also reminded of the classic study of Bosnian socialist village by Tone Bringa. So both Vera Erlich and Tone Bringa describe this feeling of these worlds disappearing almost in front of their eyes and often in flames. Yet, the world of a post-war Bosnian village has still not disappeared. So David Henig's decision to focus his research on a small village within central Bosnia seems almost defiant. It's a place that is a margin even inside of another margin, which is Bosnia, or to use the locals' metaphor, it's a badly parked car. Yet, as Henig deftly shows, the most crucial questions emerge in the realms of the neglected and the forgotten, and capture in its complexity both the larger social and political forces and the peculiar human dealings and reactions to it. So this process is constantly negotiated, but what keeps it in place is the everyday historical work that puts Muslim subjects in charge. So in other words, ruptures such as the Bosnian War, or the longer historical processes of socialist Yugoslav suppression of religion and post-war economic precarity are just some of the vicissitudes which are, in a way, thrown at Bosnian Muslims. Neither do these define and fixate Bosnian Muslims' relationship with the world, nor with other worldly matters. So what Henig suggests is that rather than being limited to these critical events, their historical work engages with other temporal frameworks and ethical considerations, of which the Islamic are among the key ones. In that regard, perhaps the most crucial question the author subtly asks is not of what Islam is, but what Islam does to these people. It is also about how people create Islam themselves through values given to spaces and times and practices. In order to do that, the author turns to the imbuing of imagination and experience which happens through the materiality of social forms. This is perhaps the most original aspect of Henig's work, which shifts the investigation to elusive and less visible elements of lived Islam. So how are Muslims making Islamic meaning from the mundane, that which is outside the ritual? By focusing on elements such as the house, family, and neighborhood, Henig brings forth the importance of an ethical framework of guardianship, which encompasses human interactions with nature, with materiality, other people, and ultimately God. So Bosnian villagers cultivate a close relationship to the land they were living on, feeling the obligation to it even as they would move to cities seeking employment. This guardianship also brings forth the gender aspects, since the division of land in communities that rely on subsistence farming makes men the primary guardians. Similarly, the obligation to the physical house, the site which Bosnian villagers usually mark with photos of Mecca and Medina, or with displays of tesbih, is also a part of the guardianship of the land. Yet the villagers feel that the obligation spreads across the land to the neighbors through practices of care articulated in forms of living together and eating together. And finally, the responsibility extends to encompass most actions one does in order to act the halal way, which is everything that satisfies Allah. So thus, and while not explicitly stated, Henig's book points to the necessity of research beyond the ritual domain. However, the ritual, whether normative, devotional, or both, is still very present in the lives of Bosnian Muslims and is also embedded in the vital exchange, which is perhaps the most important concept of this book. The major rituals of Islam are not static. they are understood and performed in tune with the times. To take, for example, Qurban, the ritual slaughter done during the Eid al-Adha. In the post-war period, the number of people who could afford to perform the deed fell drastically. At the same time, a type of halal exchange emerged, where people offer not just the scarce material resources, but also gestures of help and care in order to earn spiritual merit. People exchange a range of material and non-material things, which they understood or which they understand according to their own moral frameworks that ensure the perpetual flow of divine grace, abundance, and prosperity in their everyday lives. Non-material goods in the shape of performing a seva, a good deed, is often one of the ways in which post-war Bosnian Muslim villagers keep the flow of the vital exchange with God, even in times when the formal ritual cannot be performed. A range of additional specific terms is associated with the exchange, as Henig succinctly shows in, I think, one of the crucial passages in the book. And I quote, "Living a Muslim life consists not so much of claiming a specific ethno-national identity, but of taking part in day-to-day exchanges of blessing, bereket, prosperity, nafaka, and fortune, hayr, in good deeds and merits, sevap, and in prayers, dova, between the living, the dead, and the divine." So the ways in which Bosnian Muslim villagers experience their religion is also an object of different types of curtailing, pruning, and regulations, both by the official ulama of the Islamic community in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the external forces, such as, for example, markings of the ritual sites by the representatives of Diyanet, which is Turkish Directorate of Religious Affairs, as Henig describes in one of the last chapters. So in this way, the lived Islam described here also arises sometimes in congruence and sometimes in tension with these outside forces, as the villagers form their own critique and indeed their own normative vision of Islam. Through his rich ethnographic work, as well as his sharp perception of meaning and value-making processes through which Bosnian Muslims embed Islam in their lives, David Henig acts as a translator who keenly listens and observes, and most importantly, takes seriously the utterances and acts of his Bosnian interlocutors. So I would like to end with two questions, one, let's say, conceptual and one methodological. So I would like to go back again to Ernest Gellner's statement that to be a Bosnian Muslim today means not to believe in God. The villagers from the Zvezda Highlands, which you described, David, your interlocutors in suburbs of Sarajevo, people who struggle to survive, invoke the presence of God in every mundane or special occasion. So is there a discourse on God, a God-centered religiosity that many contemporary researchers are missing because they're focused only on the visible Islamic practices? And my second question would be, since we hear a lot about initiatives such as decolonizing knowledge, is it possible to benefit from ethnographies such as yours to, in a way, ground our critique of institutions and indeed the world in a much more productive and authentic way?
Thank you very much, Dr. Karic, for this wonderful rumination, I would say, about the book, your feedback, your comments, your very thoughtful analysis of the book's contents and the presentation, which I think complements Dr. Henig's presentation really well. So David, Janita had a couple of questions for you at the end. So if you would take maybe just a couple of minutes to address those, I know that it probably you could give a much broader answer, but just very briefly so that we can maybe turn to the questions and comments from the audience. And I would like to remind our audience that we have the chat function and on our YouTube channel. So please submit your questions or comments in the chat. Identify yourself, if you will, and we'll take it from there. So David, just maybe a couple of minutes of your remarks.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Janita. It was sorry. Very thoughtful and generous reading. of the book, and you should be doing the presentation of the book, actually. You kind of know it better than I do, but it was wonderful. So so very quickly, the first question, the discourse about God, that's a very interesting thing, and you and I talk about it a lot, that there's now kind of this emergence in academic debates that studying religion really, where is God in our studying of religion, right? And as I show in the book, it's very much present in everyday discourses. So my answer to your question is, God is everywhere. God is basically present everywhere, and that's actually the way people kind of talk, conceptualize Islam in their everyday life. There's no, and as you know, they are not trained in theology. Many of them, spent just a few years, if they were lucky, as kids in Maktab somewhere, and that's about it. So, so the figure of God is immanent, I would say, rather than transcendent. Yeah, in what people do in their everyday lives. So very much so. The second question, I guess it's not a question for me in a way to answer, but for those who would be willing to engage with this book. But one thing I would say is that another reason why it took me so long to write this book is that I try to write the book in such a way that it's not imprisoned in one particular kind of disciplinary or academic kind of ghetto or community, but to write it in such a way that even many of my interlocutors in Bosnia, once the book is translated, I hope it will be, can basically read it. Yeah. So I think there is a certain kind of degree of responsibility on our part, also how we write about these things, because I could easily kind of keep it in kind of theoretically heavy academic genre, but I'm not sure whether it would actually do any good to the debates that you mentioned. Yeah, but I think there is a certain responsibility also on our part how we write if we want to contribute to kind of decolonizing knowledge as well. So not sure whether it exactly answers your second question, but I guess it's on others, up to others, how they will use it. Yeah.
Thank you, David. So we have our first question from the audience from John from America. I guess last name is Doe, I guess, John Doe. Doesn't the privileging of lived Islam undermine the normative Hanafi Maturidi tradition in the Balkans? There has been no serious study of the Hanafi tradition, and syncretism has been privileged over orthodoxy. Orientalist travelers in the 19th century Balkans would amplify syncretism to erode the connection between Balkan Muslim and Eastern Orthodoxy. So this whole idea of lived Islam versus Orthodoxy, which officially in Bosnia is defined as Hanafi Maturidi. So David and then Janita, of course, feel free to engage this question.
Well, I mean, I don't see it as a dichotomy between kind of orthodoxy and orthopraxy. I mean, the book kind of maps out both, but talking about it in the kind of like Hanafi or whatever madhab or mazhab as they say in Bosnia is itself kind of very modern kind of category that is not necessarily kind of recognized in the lived context. So what I try to do in the book is to show how these things are sort of debated. So I have imams or hojas in the book. I think I do cover some of the theological arguments as well. But what I'm interested in is basically a completely different question than this one. I'm kind of following more what Shahab Ahmed and other people try to do, which is basically just to understand the meaning-making practices of being Muslim, or what is Islamic. And if it involves questions of, for example, of the Hanafi school, which is something I've been studying as well. It's just not in the book, but it's in other publications. Then so be it. But if it is not a matter of concern for people I've been working with, then I can't sort of impose it, on them, from outside. I don't know, Janita, if you would like to add something to it. This is kind of more your area.
Yeah, I would also agree with you, David. I don't see it as a dichotomy, lived Islam versus some kind of normative Islam, because then we would also have to ask, where does this normative Islam exist, and who creates it? Who is the proponent of it? And I don't think that it's really useful to use the word syncretism as well. And I don't think, David, that you use the word syncretism at all. And it's been a discarded term anyways in much of the, I guess, like Islamic studies and religious studies as well. So I wouldn't also see it in some kind of dichotomy or tension. But as I said during my presentation or during my, let's say, discussion of David's book, I see the way the villagers react to certain, rules and regulations coming from certain institutions as not necessarily being always in contradiction with them, but also sometimes, sometimes in tension, but sometimes, being very compliant to these rules and regulations. So I don't think we should really see that as two opposing poles.
Yeah, I can very quickly also add that the reason why I chose to follow this sort of what we can call ethical framework, following some of the debates in, from anthropology, of ethics and morality and so on, is to actually show that, again, the focus on everyday life actually, we can say, shows the life of these normative discourses, right? And at the level of discourse, things are either or, but very often, even for imams, not just for villagers and so on, the questions are actually both/and, rather than either or, and it's kind of ongoing negotiation, calibration, and so on. I describe, for example, tensions between two imams, one trained in the Gulf and one trained in Bosnian kind of Islamic milieu. And they're completely different understanding what, for example, some of these practices actually mean and how they should be practiced, right? So it's a kind of, it's not either or kind of question for me.
All right. Thank you so much for your feedback on this question. I hope the questioner did get the answers from both of you. Now we have another question coming in from Dino Avdibegovic. It says, in the political discourse, it's always Bosnian Serbs and Croats, but Bosniaks are often identified by their supposed predominant religion. What does it take for Bosnian Muslims, and not just Muslims, to be seen by others and identified by themselves as primarily Bosnians or Bosniaks rather than merely Muslims?
Yeah, that's a tough question. I guess we should ask Bosniaks, maybe the two of you guys, what it takes for you. And the honest answer is that I don't know, because that's not something I was studying. Yeah, what I think, again, I would say here is that, and I write it in the book, that the Bosniak question or ethno-national identity question and so on is very much important part of everyone I've been working with. Yeah? the only thing I'm saying in the book is that we cannot reduce everything to it. Yeah, and that's basically my point. But I don't know what it takes, Janita, for Muslim to define as Bosniak.
I really don't know what to say. Like for me, these two markers are again not in conflict. So I really don't see like why we should, pit the religious identity against whatever ethnic identity or something. But yeah.
Yeah, maybe it's just the larger modernity is, I think, anxiety with these multiple identities and with also ambiguity. I think there's a recent book that just came out called, I think, Culture of Ambiguity. Was it Bauer on Islam? Was it?
Yeah, it was actually published almost 10 years ago, but it's only now been
translated from German into English. So that book also, I think, traditional worldviews, including Muslim worldview, which I think, David, you really define so well in the book, the ability to sometimes hold even contradictory ideas at the same time. I think it comes clearly across in the book when you study everyday lives and practices of these Muslim peoples in Bosnia, but I think modernity always aims for these categorizations and very neat compartments to be put into. And so, you can be Bosniak, but maybe you cannot be Muslim at the same time, or you can be, if you're Muslim, you can be something else. And these hyphenated identities are problematic for modernity too, we see it even in official census oftentimes, a lot of times when you're filling these things out, a lot of people feel, how I really feel and what I would like to say is not really expressed on the paper. And you can continue adding as many categories as you want. There's always going to be somebody who's not going to feel that their identity is fully represented that way. So I think it points to that larger discomfort within modernity itself, with ambiguous categories, with hyphenated categories, with multiple identities. Everything has to be contextualized and compartmentalized into a neat window and box. And here is where you belong, and that's it. And everybody in that group should define themselves that way. But tell you honestly, I mean, if you ask me personally, there are days when I feel a Bosniak, there are days when I feel a Muslim, there are days when I feel a Bosnian, and I don't feel any contradiction among those identities. I sometimes feel all at the same time. So I think we maybe need to transcend that kind of neat compartmentalization that I think modernity would like to introduce to people. All right, we have another question by Alp Topol from University of Oslo. He said, not having read the book yet, I would like to ask how you would compare the religious experience in the rural environment and urban settings. Would you argue for a qualitative and or quantitative difference?
Well, thank you for all questions. I'm not sure if I think to previous questions. So thank you for the previous and this one. I'm not sure what quantitative difference would be, but qualitative, sure. There must be some differences, but again, one thing I try to show in this book, to avoid, going back to Ermin's point about these categories, dichotomies, and so on, is that, again, there is another tradition in the scholarship, writing about rural Islam versus urban Islam, right? Or sort of small tradition, big tradition, and so on. But again, in this context of upheavals, fluctuation, that half of the village lives in diaspora and another third of the village lives in Sarajevo, for example, and people are constantly in flux and so on. I think, at least in the places where I've been working, the rural-urban divide is it's a different kind of space in a way. It's where people kind of navigate these lives. But of course, I have spent a lot of time in various urban spaces in Bosnia, and again, Janita and Ermin can add something to it. But of course, there are also completely different, I would say, opportunities for kind of experiencing religion, for example, in places like Sarajevo, in terms of you have lectures, you have tekiyas, you have sort of sheikhs, you have all these things happening that, for example, you don't have obviously in many of these villages. But I would say the main qualitative difference would be the materiality of religion that I write about in the book, which again spans these temporal horizons and which kind of manifests in the land, the trees, houses, and things like that. That's probably something that, and of course the neighborhood communities, yeah, because I know that the pre-war, for example, in pre-war Sarajevo, the concept of neighborhood, komşuluk, mahala, and things like that had a very different meaning than they have it now, obviously, after the war, where so many people left, died, the whole urban infrastructure changed and so on. Yeah, there are many qualitative differences, but also similarities. But I think what's important to keep in mind is that maybe the rural urban is not the best kind of dichotomy to understand these dislocations and upheavals that we are dealing with in the post-war years. I don't know, Janita.
Yeah, Janita, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I think that there is also a factor of mobility, which is very neatly presented in David's book. There is this whole mobility from villages into larger Bosnian cities and beyond to Western and Central Europe, which in a way, again, blurs this divide between rural and urban. And in a way fleshes out what house really means when you have someone who has been transplanted almost violently from village to a suburb of Sarajevo. So what house means to these people. So I think mobility should also be taken into account.
Yeah, maybe one quick think very quickly before Ermin will add his point is also that I think maybe I missed it, but I think there isn't any study, and it would be interesting to have this study, is these kind of urban peripheries of Bosnian big cities. They often, at least my experience, fieldwork experience, is that like whole villages basically group together again in these kind of urban, kind of semi-urban, kind of at the outskirts of big cities. So for example, Vogošća, kind of one of the places where I did fieldwork, there are whole neighborhoods that basically replicate the village neighborhoods in this urban environment, right? So people who were neighbors in the village build their houses in this urban periphery. So what is it? Is it a village? Is it a neighborhood, urban neighborhood? It's a kind of very fluid and dynamic space. But it's an interesting question to think about.
Yeah, thanks, David. I don't see. Oh yeah, there is one more. It says, what consequences do you see from Egduna Asaracio's thesis of statification and securitization of Balkan Islam and the intrusion of the state more broadly, like in Egypt? Does that do you get the idea from this question? Do you understand? Not really. So maybe the questioner could maybe elaborate on this. In the meantime, when I first received the book, of course, I was reminded, as I'm sure many had been, of Tone Bringas Being Muslim the Bosnian Way, right? In many ways, a similar book, you know, anthropological study, ethnographic study done at a very particular site in Bosnia. The difference being that one was done before the war, this one was done after the war. So I'm sure David, of course, and Janita, you are familiar with that book. How do you, I wouldn't want to use the word compare, but how do you put these two books together in a way? You know, are we seeing some differences? There's a lot of similarities too between the two books and what they talk about. But I think it'd be interesting really to put these two books in the conversation and see where we are, both in terms of methods of studying that everyday Islam in Bosnia, but also in terms of our findings and outcomes and continuities and ruptures and change. So maybe each of you take a couple of minutes maybe to reflect on this, if you will, if you don't mind, and you don't have to.
Well, it's a tough one, and again, I don't like talking about myself, so maybe Janita is kind of better equipped to do that. No, I'm obviously very much familiar with Tone's work. She, by the way, was my PhD examiner, so I know quite a bit about the book. Well, I think the most important difference is that Tone Bringa did focus on the identity aspect, right? So, and it was inevitable because she worked in a village that was half Bosnian Muslims, half Bosnian Croats, and the book basically is how Muslim identity is being constructed in difference, right? So in relation to the presence of Croats, basically, and these rituals they have, neighborliness and so on. But I tried to develop a framework in this book that kind of avoids this identitarian perspective, and that will hopefully be also useful for other religions in the region, because religion in general, the study of religion in the Balkans or Southeast Europe is reduced to these ethno-national identities questions. But I'm really interested in how ritual, cosmology, whatever you have, the image of God, as Janita mentioned, and so on, really shapes people's practice, meaning making practices, and so on, to answer the question of how to live rather than who I am, and that's where I think is the main difference in the approach, because the starting position is completely different. Yeah. Last point is that at the same time, I hope that there is some connection between the two books, because I, in a way, did pick up where kind of Tone sort of ended, because the conclusion of her book obviously reflects on the war and all these changes that happen as a result of the war, and she kind of leaves the book kind of what will happen to Muslims and so on is a kind of open-ended question that will require further research. Interestingly, in my view, no one really picked up on this, at least in social sciences in the way, for example, she did. And interestingly, we have very little studies from non-urban kind of big cities in Bosnia about anything, not necessarily about religion. But this whole kind of scale of disappearance of village life, rural life, that has been backbone of Bosnian society for such a long time, it's just non-existent.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, David. Janita?
Well, I think the circumstances surrounding the Tone Bringa's book and the fate of the book, and later on, I think that she even made a documentary which is loosely based on the book, in many ways shape how we see that book now. I think it's almost 30 years after it came out, or 25 years. So I know many people in Bosnia, they reflect very fondly on the book. And I think it does tap into certain sensibilities which and self-reflections which Bosnians do want to identify themselves with. So I just think that we need to wait another, maybe not another 25 years to see the reception of David's book, but maybe it would be comparable after David's book has been around for some time.
All right, thanks. So we have elaboration on the earlier question. It says that Ignaz Rachis has a book called Islam in Post-Communist Eastern Europe and charts the expansion of state control, especially with central ulema hierarchies, much like while Halak charts with Sharia. Does that ring any bell? I guess my take on this question is that it's about basically how the state's interference with Islam and the official Islamic hierarchies, sort of that interaction also produces certain outcomes. But then I'm thinking, and I'll leave it to you too, but I'm thinking that it never really was separate. You know, during the Ottoman times, obviously religious hierarchy was under politics. Then the modern Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina was created during the Austro-Hungarian times, right? So it was heavily state influenced. Then you have the Yugoslavia's, you know, whether it be the you know, Kraljevina Srba, Hrvata i Slovenaca, or, you know, later on Yugoslavia, then communist Yugoslavia. And in each of those iterations, you had very strong state control interaction with religious hierarchies. Maybe the only dimension that is in some way new, especially after 9/11, but even before 9/11, is this securitization of Islam. You know, it started with, you know, the so-called foreign fighters. You know, Darrell Lee wrote so much about it, and then of course after 9/11 especially. So I think maybe that's what the question is aiming at. So maybe if any of you would like to add anything to this, but that, in my understanding, is what this is about.
Well, you kind of nicely summarize what's going on in Bosnia. I don't know. I would need to think about it a little bit more, but I do have in the book a kind of brief history of the Islamic community of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and, you know, back to the Ottoman times. Or the Austro-Hungarian times, because it was basically created then. But I would actually say that in a way, in the post-war / post-socialist kind of context in Bosnia, the state is probably the least involved, you know, from all these kind of previous periods, yeah, when it comes to the kind of the heavy securitization kind of aspect, right? Because basically, you know, all these debates on religious freedoms and so on. So I don't know. I think it's almost kind of maybe different or kind of opposite trajectory in a way. I don't know what you think, Janita, but I think, like, you know, when I compare the involvement of the state, of the socialist state, for example, to religious affairs, and now, I think they are incomparable in terms of religious freedom, right?
I guess nation-state framework is just one modernist framework which we have to deal with, whether we are doing a research on, you know, Egypt or Bosnia or Indonesia or whatever. And if I may, if this is not the wrong place, I would like to plug in another book which I read in dialogue with David's book. It's Kevin Reinhardt's Lived Islam, which I think in a very nice way proposes a conceptual tool, a very nice conceptual model through which you can actually see how all these different layers, let's say state Islam or state-sponsored Islam or state-propagated Islam, how it affects or how it's affected in the other direction by lived Islam or local Islam, or, you know, there are different layers which Kevin Reinhardt proposes. But I think, yeah, one of the things which need to be stated is that yeah, the state framework is something which is an omnipresent framework, which each one of us has to deal with.
But of course, the question and the reason why I mentioned this thing, that like compared, for example, with the socialist period, I think, situation is different, is that obviously, what does the state actually mean in post-war Bosnia, right? It's the sovereignty is so fragmented because of, the Dayton Peace Agreement. The whole idea of the state is fragmented, for many people, it's a kind of empty kind of concept, right? So I think compared, for example, with Egypt, where the sovereignty is really kind of centralized, right, and power of the state and so on, the idea of the state in the post-war context and state sovereignty, you need to take this fragmentation into account as well, right? But at the same time, as Janita said, of course, it's another kind of immanent thing, right? It's basically everywhere. So you can kind of think beyond that in this regard.
Yeah, thank you, David. So I think we're coming to an end of our allocated time. I don't see any more questions from the audience. So I think this probably would be a good point to stop. I'm sure there are still many things that we would like to discuss and many points, but I think we have really covered many of the important aspects of the book, and I hope that our readers and others, our viewers and others are going to read this book and discuss it. And I'm sure it will be discussed for years to come. And once the Bosnian translation is completed, I'm sure it will be discussed even more in Bosnia. So once again, Dr. David Henig, Dr. Janita Kavic, I would like to thank you for your time and for your wonderful presentations. And I'm wishing you all the best in your work. And thanks to everyone who has joined us this morning or this evening on YouTube.
Thank you, Ermin, for organizing it. Thank you, Janita, for your comments. And thank you for all your wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ermin.
Thanks.